don't race to change the channel as we review this basic Biostar board, the H170GT3. Well, it's not really that basic. Okay, so this is the first time that I have ever taken a look at a Biostar motherboard. This is the H170GT3. Now, if you're not familiar, the H170 chipset, unlike the Z170 chipset, the H170 chipset is sort of a mainstream chipset. It's from Intel. Intel officially is like, no, you shouldn't overclock an H170, and no, you shouldn't do this. It's sort of in business class machines. Now, this motherboard, because it's got racing in the name, is not a business class motherboard. But this is Biostar's shot at doing a budget board, relatively budget board, that has some blingy features, but is otherwise a relatively modest, relatively basic micro ATX motherboard. So if you take a look at the board layout's actually pretty standard. There's plenty of room around the CPU socket for whatever kind of cooler that you might want to use. It is a little close to the RAM on the RAM side, but all in all, it's not really too bad. You've got the 8-pin ATX power at the top of the board. You've got your CPU fan, and you've got a 50/50 LED header. Now, I'm going to talk more about this LED header in just a minute. Around the front edge of the motherboard, we've got the front panel connector, the SATA Express connector. Now, if you're not going to use SATA Express, you can use the two connections in here for SATA 6 connections. There's also two more SATA 6 connections just above that, so you can have a total of 4 SATA 6 connections, or 2 SATA 6 connections and 1 SATA Express connection. Then you've got your ATX power, and then just above that, you've got touch buttons, which are power, reset, eco mode, and sport mode. Along the bottom edge of the motherboard, you've got your front panel audio, your RS-232 header, your front USB 2.0 header, 1 and 2, so you've got 4 USB 2.0 ports that are available through these two headers. Then you've got 2 USB 3.0 headers. Now, the Intel H170 chipset supports a maximum of 8 USB 3.0 ports. This board makes available all 8. There's 4 at the midboard here for your front panel connections, and there's 4 on the back of the board as well. There are 2 fan connectors along the bottom edge of the motherboard as well. There's also a switch at the bottom edge of the motherboard that allows you to pick between the A and the B BIOS. And then of course we've got our front panel header. If you take a look at the board layout, it's actually pretty intelligent. The best thing that I like about the layout on this board is that the M.2 slot is above the graphics card. Now, if you're running an M.2, like the Samsung 951 or one of the other premium M.2s, those tend to get pretty toasty. And because they get pretty toasty, they need to be able to breathe. And in order for them to be able to breathe, they need airflow. Sometimes the M.2 slot is sort of crammed in between the slots. They may not get the best airflow ever. With the M.2 slot here, just below the CPU, there's going to be extra fan movement or extra air current movement, especially if you use a tower cooler or a regular CPU cooler or even a premium CPU cooler. There's going to be sufficient airflow around the CPU socket to keep those M.2s like the Samsung 951 or whatever you might be running cool. So that's a good feature. In terms of the PCI Express configuration, the 16 PCI Express lanes that are wired directly into the CPU are all exposed on the first PCI X by 16 slot. The other 3 PCI Express slots, the 2x1 slots and the other by 16 slot, are wired through the DMI. The one on the bottom is a by 4 electrical connection, and then you've got 2 PCI Express by 1s. Now, if you're going to run an NVMe or a second M.2 or something like that, you're going to want to do it in the bottom slot. That's going to give you 4 PCI Express 3.0 lanes of connectivity, but that does go through the DMI, and so that's going to share bandwidth with whatever else is going through the DMI, because the DMI has about 4 PCI Express lanes worth of bandwidth on top of the 16 that are wired directly into the CPU. Alright, let's do a quick rundown of the back panel of this thing. First up, we've got PS2 mouse and keyboard. That's really good for me because I like to use the Model M keyboard. So we've got a direct connection right there to the PS2 Model M. The Model M is a glorious keyboard. We've also got DVI-D and 2 HDMI connections. Now, the manual on the HDMI connections is kind of funny. It says that it will support 4096 by 2160 at 24 Hertz, but it's an HDMI 1.4a connection, not an HDMI 2.0 connection, according to the manual. However, all 3 of these graphics options are provided by the Intel chipset. So I'm not sure if support for anything beyond HDMI 1.4a will be coming, but I suspect this is probably a limitation of the H170 chipset, because Intel initially with the Z170 chipset had a more limited HDMI implementation, but they were able to do some software wizardry and make that a little bit better, because the first generation Skylake boards we looked at had a lot of problems with HDMI on Z170 running 4K at 60 Hertz. But officially, according to the motherboard manual and the website, these HDMI ports will only run HDMI 1.4a, so keep that in mind. Then next to that, we've got our 4 USB 3.0 ports, 2 more USB 2.0 ports. This is our LAN connection. This is provided by the Intel i219V, so that is an actual real Intel adapter. The audio codec on this motherboard is nothing fancy. It's the Realtek ALC 887. It does have, board isolation, but the capacitors and all this other kind of stuff is just sort of a middle-of-the-road audio solution. If you're looking for a premium audio, you probably would want to use an add-in sound card or a USB DAC type solution anyway. So there's one other feature of this motherboard that's kind of neat, and that is the Vivid LED DJ. At least that's what Biostar calls it. What this is an RGB LED controller that's built into the motherboard. Now, Biostar also provides software that lets you control that. They provide an interface on the board to control the LEDs that are part of the VRM heatsink assembly, as well as some LEDs at the back of the board. And then they also have the optional 50/50 LED header that I was mentioning earlier. Now, this 50/50 LED header is a sort of an industry standard for 50/50 LED strips. You can get those from eBay. You can get those directly from Biostar. I think there's a version of this motherboard that actually comes with, a several meter strip of LEDs that you can use to cut down and customize. So if you want to do a custom lighting type deal with your case, this is a micro ATX board with a built-in LED controller. So if you want to do RGB LED lighting in a strip format and you want it to be controlled by your motherboard, well, this motherboard's got a built-in controller that you would be able to do that, and a header that you can break out and run your LED strips. So that's pretty neat. The software itself lets you sort of pick and choose what color you want it to be. You can also make it move to the music and some other different operational modes. You should check that out. It's sort of fun to play with. For our testing, we threw an Intel i5 6600K in this thing. There are some limited overclocking options in the UEFI, but Intel, through microcode updates either in the operating system or the UEFI, will probably lock that down, as we've seen in the past. And so I'm hesitant to say, oh yeah, you can get this board and do overclocking, because Intel doesn't officially sanction overclocking on the H170 chipset, which I think is pretty crappy of Intel. But what are you going to do? They say, oh, it doesn't work in spec or whatever. So in terms of what this board is, in terms of an H170 board, a budget-oriented sort of value-conscious board, it's not bad. It survived our burn-in tests, which were not super extensive. It does have an adequate power delivery circuit, I think, especially even if you're going to run, an i5 and an i7. I would not suggest that it makes sense to get a K part for this. You should probably get a desktop part, a part not really designed for overclocking. It is nice that it has 4 DDR4 RAM slots. We were running the G-Skill RAM in this particular board. The one weird thing is the XMP profile was showing 2133 megahertz across the board when the G-Skill RAM can actually clock higher than that on its XMP profile. So I'm not really sure if that's a limitation of the H170 chipset or some other type of limitation. Maybe that'll be overcome with the UEFI update. I did not really dig into that too much. But overall, the board, in terms of operations and software polish and that kind of thing, it was stable. I didn't encounter any show-stopping issues with the UEFI. Overall, not a terrible board. It's actually pretty decent. It's a pretty decent value-oriented, budget-conscious board. Biostar at least does advertise for the voltage delivery circuit that these are 10K rated components, meaning 10,000 hour rated components, I think. So that type of messaging tells me that they built this thing with longevity in mind. But again, this is a budget-oriented board, so keep that in mind. One other thing about this motherboard was that it was disturbingly lightweight. So picking up and handling it, even though it is a micro ATX and physically a micro ATX board is physically smaller, it was an astonishingly lightweight motherboard. So they've really got the process down pat, I think, on manufacturing for this particular generation, because holy crap, it was a very lightweight motherboard. It was startlingly light. Now, because I personally do not have a lot of experience with Biostar motherboards, I was sort of curious about this motherboard when it came in, and I wanted to build a system with it and play with it. Now, admittedly, I only built a system with it on my test bench, so it was sort of open air and a lot of fun and sort of goofing off with it and doing that. Installed Windows 10 and messed around with it and that sort of thing. So I'm going to keep this board on my test bench for the next couple of weeks and put it through its paces. Biostar is sort of known for being a sort of value-conscious choice in terms of motherboard manufacturers. I think, at least to me, it is. And I'm curious if you guys that have purchased parts from Biostar, what your experiences are. What's your experience with an RMA process? What's your experience with the actual board? Share with the rest of the group, if you will, at the Tech Syndicate forums. I'm Wendell, I'm signing out, and I'll see you later.